Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. They called her Jane Doe, but someone knew her name. Someone held the truth for 34 years, until a photo, a scar, and a skull told the story she couldn't. And now, in 2025, justice still hasn't caught up. On July 20th, 1980, a young woman from Nashua, New Hampshire, left home with her boyfriend and was never seen alive again. Her name was Brenda Marie Gerow, 20 years old. She didn't take much with her, just a duffel bag, a handful of clothes, and a Polaroid photo someone had taken of her holding a bouquet of flowers. It was supposed to be the start of something new. She made one brief call home from New Mexico. That was the last time anyone in her family heard her voice. At the time, police considered her a missing adult, not a priority case. There was no evidence of abduction, no signs of foul play. In the summer of 1980, law enforcement in New Hampshire logged it as a possible voluntary disappearance. The trail ended there. Her family insisted something was wrong. Brenda had never gone more than a few days without contact, but without a clear jurisdictional lead, without even proof of a crime, there was nothing more authorities could do. What no one knew at the time was that just 8 months later, in Pima County, Arizona, the body of an unidentified young woman would be discovered under grim circumstances. She would remain nameless for more than 3 decades. The man Brenda left with, John Jack Calhauser, was known to the family but not trusted. He was older, almost 40. Records show he'd served time in the 1970s for manslaughter in Massachusetts. Brenda's family didn't know the full extent of his record. At the time, Calhauser had already changed jurisdictions multiple times. His court files were fragmented across state lines. Calhauser presented himself as a reformed man, working odd jobs and living under varying versions of his legal name. In 1980, he convinced Brenda to leave Nashua with him, claiming they'd start a new life in the Southwest. She agreed. There are no known bank records, rental agreements, or employment filings for Brenda under her name in Arizona or New Mexico in 1980 or 1981. It's likely she never had the chance to register anywhere. Her Social Security activity went completely silent after that summer. On April 8, 1981, a body was found off South Wilmot Road near Tucson, Arizona, in a desert clearing not far from the fairgrounds. A local man was scouting hunting trails when he spotted something unusual near a mesquite tree. Denim fabric hanging unnaturally in the wind. Beneath it, partially concealed by dry brush, were human remains. Pima County Sheriff's Office responded. The scene was processed as a homicide. The body was that of a white female, estimated 18 to 22 years old. Decomposition was advanced. The skull had post-mortem exposure. No ID was found. Autopsy showed signs of ligature strangulation, blunt force trauma to the face and jaw, and indications of possible sexual assault. Her fingernails were painted, a small but notable detail. One silver earring remained in her left ear. Fingerprint recovery was attempted but yielded no matches in state or federal databases. Dental records were unavailable. Facial reconstruction methods in 1981 were limited. She was listed as a Jane Doe, and the case went cold almost immediately. At the time, law enforcement had no reason to connect her to Brenda. Brenda's missing person report was on file in a completely different region, New Hampshire. The states were not cross-checking unidentified remains with missing adults in 1981. There was no centralized system, no NamUs database, no DNA bank to match against. The Pima County Jane Doe was buried under a concrete marker labeled UNC, 1981. Her case file gathered dust in a Tucson records facility, occasionally reviewed but never actively worked. Fast forward to 2012. The Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner initiated a new round of cold case exhumations. As part of a grant-backed forensic program, the county began reprocessing unidentified remains using modern techniques: CT imaging, isotopic analysis, mitochondrial DNA sequencing, and digital facial reconstruction. Jane Doe, 1981, was selected as one of the targets. Forensic anthropologists created a digital rendering from the CT scan of her skull. They estimated her origin to be likely northeastern U.S., based on isotopic traces in her hair and bone calcium, suggesting she had lived her early life in a region with low fluoride water and higher natural isotope variation, consistent with New England. That clue, though not definitive, narrowed the list. Her facial reconstruction was uploaded to NamUs and NCMEC. Meanwhile, back in New Hampshire, a retired detective working cold cases reviewed Brenda Gerow's file for the first time in over 20 years. He noted that Brenda's disappearance in 1980 had never been conclusively resolved. When shown the Jane Doe reconstruction, he flagged a possible resemblance. But resemblance isn't enough. DNA was needed. By 2014, a new clue emerged. An old photograph, once submitted during an unrelated murder investigation in Arizona, was re-reviewed. It showed a young woman in a field, holding a bouquet of flowers. A forensic image analyst noted striking similarities between her and the Jane Doe rendering. That photo had been submitted years earlier as part of the Diane Van Reeth homicide file, Cal Hauser's later wife, who also disappeared under suspicious circumstances in 1995. When questioned, Cal Hauser had referred to the woman in the photo as an old girlfriend. Her name, according to the original evidence log, was written on the back, Brenda. In 2015, DNA extracted from the exhumed remains of Jane Doe matched a sample from Brenda Gerow's surviving brother. The confirmation was swift and undisputed. After 34 years, the woman found in the desert in 1981 finally had her name back. The desert doesn't hide secrets well. It preserves them. On the morning of April 8, 1981, deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department were dispatched to a remote area southeast of Tucson, Arizona. Coordinates logged from a hunter's call described the site as a dirt pull-off near South Wilmot Road, about 3 miles from the old fairgrounds entrance. The terrain was dry, dusty, and exposed. No camera poles, no traffic, no water access. The area was rarely used except by locals or people deliberately avoiding detection. The first responding officers described a partially concealed female body in moderate decomposition, laying in brush just off the gravel path. Close by, a denim jacket had been draped on a mesquite limb. The placement wasn't random. It drew the eye. Crime scene technicians logged the initial environmental conditions. Temperature at 89 degrees, slight wind, no recent rainfall. Based on insect activity and mummification signs, the medical examiner later estimated the body had been there between 2 to 5 days. Long enough for evidence to degrade, but not long enough to completely erase it. Clothing analysis was limited. The victim wore a faded t-shirt with no logos, generic underwear, and socks. No pants or shoes were recovered. Her fingernails were painted metallic pink, which stood out starkly against the gray tone of her skin. A single silver earring remained in her left lobe. The right one had been torn or pulled off, an injury noted as perimortem. Next to the body, investigators recovered one small blue hair tie, a bent bobby pin, oxidized a cigarette butt, Vantage partially smoked, fabric fibers that did not match the clothing on the victim. Each item was bagged and labeled. Soil samples were taken from beneath the torso and limbs to test for time of placement, as the earth there retained heat and chemical traces. A pathologist later noted that the soil composition under her back was slightly compressed, suggesting she had been placed, not thrown, into position. There were no tire tracks nearby. If a vehicle had brought her there, it stopped well off-road. That level of caution, investigators later commented, suggested familiarity with the area. The body was transported to the Pima County office of the medical examiner. Autopsy revealed multiple injuries consistent with manual strangulation and blunt force trauma. The hyoid bone was fractured, typical in female victims of strangulation. Lividity patterns and fixed rigor placed her time of death approximately 48 hours prior to discovery. Trace analysis revealed foreign fibers embedded in her neck bruising. Synthetic blend, dark blue, consistent with drawstring cord or athletic wear. No such clothing was recovered at the scene. Under UV light, a small abrasion was noted across the lower abdomen, possibly from friction against a rough surface. The medical report logged her as Caucasian, age 18 to 22, 5 and 3, approximately 110 lbs. No signs of recent dental work, no tattoos, no identifying scars except for a faint, healed cut on her right forearm, roughly 3 inches in length. Later confirmed to be a childhood scar Brenda had since age 9. Her stomach contents were minimal, mostly bile. Toxicology showed no signs of drugs or alcohol. The cause of death was listed as asphyxiation due to ligature strangulation, with secondary trauma to the face and neck. Back in 1981, forensic analysis had limits. The items found, hair tie, cigarette earring, were entered into evidence, but no DNA testing was possible. Fingerprint lifting on the earring clasp yielded nothing usable. The cigarette butt was preserved in cold storage, but again, no match in databases at the time. This left investigators with a familiar but frustrating conclusion. No known ID, no active missing persons case in Arizona matching the body, and no way to cross-reference out-of-state reports effectively. The case was classified as homicide, but without a name, the investigation stalled. She became Jane Doe number 1434, filed under Pima County's Unidentified Persons Ledger, stored in archival paper and microfilm. The most chilling part? Aside from the earring, nothing on her body was personally identifying. No wallet, no photos, not even initials stitched into clothing. It was as if someone had deliberately erased every clue that connected her to a life before death. In towns like Tucson, unclaimed bodies haunt more than just case files. They hang over communities as silent reminders of crimes too clean, too careful, too untraceable. This one was no different. Forensic investigators noted something else: the complete absence of insects in the victim's mouth and nostrils, which typically indicates a post-mortem relocation. Meaning, she likely didn't die where she was found. That detail alone altered the scope of the investigation. Now, they weren't just looking for a killer, they were trying to map two crime scenes. But in 1981, lacking centralized databases, forensic mapping, and DNA, the cold trail was accepted as unsolvable. Jane Doe was buried in a county cemetery with the case marked as pending identification. Decades later, when that identification came, it wouldn't be because of a witness or a confession. It would be because the physical evidence had been preserved. By the early 1980s, the investigation into Jane Doe 1434 in Pima County had hit a wall. The forensics were complete, the autopsy filed, the scene logged. What they lacked was context, someone to explain how a young woman from New England ended up dead in the Arizona desert. But there was no match in missing persons, no family searching in that region, and no suspect on record. What investigators didn't know then was that this wasn't an isolated case. The details of her death, carefully executed strangulation, absence of personal identifiers, post-mortem relocation, shared structural similarities with other unresolved incidents. Not enough to claim a serial pattern, but too methodical to ignore. In 2025, with the benefit of hindsight and improved national data networks, law enforcement would go back and examine those overlooked consistencies. But even in 1981, detectives in Tucson quietly noted what they called a professional dump. The body placement, the attempt to delay discovery, and the stripped identity all suggested someone who knew what they were doing. In 1980, Brenda Gerow left New Hampshire with a man who was neither a stranger to law enforcement nor a stranger to violence. He wasn't considered a suspect in her disappearance at the time, not officially. He had a prior conviction for manslaughter in Massachusetts, but had been released after serving a reduced sentence. He used multiple aliases and moved frequently across state lines. Public records show that between 1979 and 1981, he had registered vehicles in at least 3 states, including Arizona. At one point, he held a temporary address in Tucson under a variation of his legal name, just miles from where Brenda's body would later be found. Neighbors interviewed in the area couldn't recall seeing a woman matching Brenda's description, but most of them had only known him for a few months, if at all. He never reported Brenda missing. No welfare check was requested. No contact with her family was maintained after the day she left. When questioned in later years regarding other disappearances, he referred to Brenda only as an old girlfriend who probably went back east. He gave no details. That vagueness would later matter. By the mid-1990s, that same man would become a suspect in the disappearance of another woman, his legal spouse at the time, who vanished without warning. This second case would eventually result in a murder conviction, though no body was ever found. That's rare in American courtrooms. Prosecutors in that trial relied on a long trail of circumstantial evidence, behavioral inconsistencies, and motive derived from financial fraud. What re-emerged during that case was a single photograph. a woman standing in a field holding flowers. It had been logged years earlier and nearly discarded. But when investigators took a second look in 2014, after the Jane Doe from Arizona was digitally reconstructed, they made a visual connection. That woman in the photo was believed to be Brenda Gerow. The question that followed was procedural. Had anyone ever documented him in Arizona in 1981? The answer was yes. DMV records and archived vehicle registrations showed he'd owned a 1973 Ford pickup, gray with rusted side panels, registered in Maricopa County in late March of that year. Police later confirmed he had paid cash for a short-term storage unit in Tucson during the same period. The unit was cleared out before law enforcement could search it, and the rental records were only preserved due to a billing error. This placed him in temporal and geographic proximity to the body discovery site. It didn't prove guilt, but it narrowed the list of people worth looking at. Retired investigators familiar with cold case methodology often say the same thing. In murder cases, details don't just fade, they get buried in paperwork, but they're still there, waiting for someone to connect them. In Brenda's case, a secondary forensic audit in 2015, after her remains were identified, allowed analysts to recheck the items found at the scene. The silver earring had been stored correctly, and newer tests revealed smudged traces of industrial lubricant, something not explained by outdoor exposure alone. The same compound was used in certain mechanical parts, common in storage unit roll doors and auto repair shops. That chemical trace didn't yield fingerprints or DNA, but it confirmed the body had likely been moved using tools or inside a vehicle that wasn't entirely clean. That fit the behavioral profile of someone accustomed to relocating objects, possibly multiple times. And it reinforced one important shift in the investigation: the assumption that Brenda's death wasn't spontaneous. It showed planning, purpose, someone who had done it, or something like it, before. To those unfamiliar with cold case work, it may seem like every discovery is monumental. In reality, the progress is often statistical, procedural, built from small things: a missed signature, a phone record misfiled, or a date that no longer aligns with the story given. In 2025, task force members reviewing the Gerow file added an annotation to their timeline. Subject of interest had clear access to remote dump site, traveled with victim across state lines. No alibi at TOD, prior violent offense, history of victim disappearance X2. They weren't yet naming a killer, but the list of unknowns had narrowed, and the behavioral map was now sharp enough to notice a pattern. In 2012, the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner began implementing a systematic review of its oldest cold cases involving unidentified remains. The initiative, backed by federal funding and forensic advancement programs, prioritized exhumations of victims buried without names, starting with cases that still held physical evidence in viable condition. Jane Doe, number 1434, found in the desert outside Tucson in 1981, met all criteria. She had been buried in a controlled burial environment, her remains cataloged, tissue samples preserved, and trace evidence bagged. Her case had never been closed, only stalled by decades of technological limitation. Now she was back on the table, literally. The county's forensic anthropology team initiated a full CT scan of the skull. Using a Siemens Somatom definition AS Plus system, technicians created high-resolution axial slices for digital rendering. The cranium showed consistent signs of trauma to the maxilla and orbital ridge. What stood out, however, wasn't the blunt force pattern, it was the preserved morphology of her facial structure. That's what allowed the digital reconstruction to proceed with above-average accuracy. Facial approximation software used data from over 2,000 known composite references and generated a three-dimensional image of what Jane Doe likely looked like at time of death. The rendering, confirmed and refined by forensic artists, depicted a young white female, narrow jawline, pronounced cheekbones, short to mid-length hair. She was estimated to be between 18 and 22 years old. Her skull shape and nasal aperture, when layered with age regression and isotopic projection, pointed to a northeastern U.S. origin. This wasn't guesswork. It was based on stable isotope analysis. Bone samples were tested for strontium and oxygen isotope ratios. The results strongly suggested she had consumed water sourced from a lower fluoride, higher deuterium region, specifically consistent with the geology of southern New Hampshire and parts of Massachusetts. In combination with isotope markers in her femur, indicating diet high in wheat, corn, and animal protein, investigators concluded with 87% certainty that she had grown up in the northeastern United States. The anthropological lead wrote in the case log, "Unlikely native to Arizona. Probable long-distance travel or relocation within 3 weeks of death." That note turned a regional murder investigation into an interstate case. For the first time, Pima County began cross-referencing missing persons cases from outside Arizona. In early 2014, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System NamUs database returned a potential match. A missing female listed in New Hampshire, Brenda Gerow, reported by her family in mid-1980, had never been located or removed from the database. She fit the age, height, weight, and dental profile range. No known tattoos, scar on the forearm, reportedly last seen traveling southwest with an older man, identity then unconfirmed. However, database-only matches don't close cases. They initiate confirmation protocols. The next step was familial DNA. Investigators contacted surviving relatives of Brenda Gerow in Nashua. Her brother voluntarily provided a buccal swab, which was processed using mitochondrial DNA testing. In October 2015, the results came back conclusive. The match was positive. Jane Doe number 1434 was Brenda Marie Gerow, last seen alive in New Mexico in July 1980. The moment the case file was updated in the Pima County system, the cold case unit reopened the homicide investigation under her true name. A new death certificate was issued, and her status in NamUs was officially changed from unidentified to resolved homicide victim. Re-identification didn't just provide a name, it provided a timeline. With the isotope evidence confirming her recent relocation and her disappearance dated precisely to mid-1980, investigators could now work backwards. Matching her last known contact to the time of death estimation, based on initial autopsy and entomological data, detectives placed her date of death between April 3rd and April 6, 1981. That gave them a forensic time window of roughly 9 months between her disappearance and the murder. 9 months in which she traveled, lived, or was concealed. Where and how remained unknown. What was known now was the endpoint and who she had left with. A man who had since resurfaced in a separate murder case, where the victim had also never been found. This time, investigators had a body, a reconstruction, a name, and a direct chain of forensic evidence to re-examine. In a quiet back office of the sheriff's department, a cold case investigator wrote in her notebook, "She had a name, but for 34 years no one could hear it. Now the timeline has a start. Let's move forward from the end." That line was never entered into the official report, but it marked a shift, from unidentified victim to targeted homicide case. The reactivation of Brenda Gerow's file would soon prompt a full review of past suspects, particularly those with criminal ties to multiple disappearances. When the name Brenda Marie Gerow was officially linked to the unidentified remains buried for over 3 decades, the cold case team had more than just a victim to work with. They had a timeline. And when a timeline is in place, you start looking for patterns. Investigators turned their attention back to 1980. Brenda had left New Hampshire with a man almost twice her age. His name at the time was John Jack Kalhauser, but he had cycled through variations of aliases over the years. By 1981, he had already relocated several times. His record in New England included a 1974 manslaughter conviction, reduced by plea. The details: he fatally stabbed the estranged husband of a woman he was dating. That alone didn't confirm involvement in Brenda's death. But the behavioral trail, the isolation of female partners, mobility across state lines, refusal to report missing persons, was worth attention. What struck investigators wasn't just the history of violence. It was the repeat pattern of disappearance that followed his relationships. Brenda wasn't the last. In 1995, more than a decade after Brenda was buried without a name, Kalhauser was again under scrutiny. This time, the case involved Diane Van Reeth, his then-wife. She went missing in Arizona. No body was ever found. Kalhauser claimed she had left him. He didn't file a report. Friends of Diane told police she had expressed fear for her safety weeks before vanishing. The case went cold until 1999, when prosecutors in Arizona built a murder case without a body. Cal Hauser was convicted based on a combination of circumstantial evidence, false statements, and inconsistent financial activity, including a forged signature on a check in Diane's name. That conviction gave the Pima County team grounds to revisit Brenda's case through a behavioral lens. Was Brenda his first known victim? If so, had the same pre- and post-crime behavior applied? The answer came through travel and residency records. DMV filings placed Cal Hauser in Tucson, Arizona, in March 1981, living under a variation of his legal name. A week before Brenda's body was discovered, he transferred title of his truck and moved out of a short-term rental. The address was just 9 miles from where her body was later found. It wasn't evidence that could secure an arrest. Not in 1981, not even now. But in terms of building a behavioral offender profile, it was consistent with mobility, location awareness, and calculated disposal. The fact that he never contacted Brenda's family again after 1980, never acknowledged her death when it made news years later, and continued to deny any knowledge of her fate, these were red flags. Detectives know that silence can be strategy. What added weight to the pattern was the similarity in post-crime tactics. Both Brenda and Diane disappeared without trace. Neither were reported missing by Cal Hauser. Both were associated with him during the final period of contact. Both were presumed to have walked away based solely on his word. In both cases, he attempted to pivot attention toward their supposed instability, alleged past trauma, or desire to leave. And both women were later confirmed by independent sources to have expressed unease and fear shortly before their disappearances. These weren't coincidental relationships that ended in separation. They were erased timelines, interrupted without closure, sealed by someone else's version of events. In building a case today, that history matters, because when a pattern repeats across state lines through multiple victims, with no exonerating evidence to counter it, investigators move forward with cautious confidence. The consistency is the clue. There's a line from one of the original investigators that stood out in the case notes. You can't convict a pattern, but you can follow it. That's what brought the Pima County team to formally designate Cal Hauser a person of interest in Brenda's case in 2025. Not a suspect, not yet, but with her identity confirmed, her connection to him reestablished, and his prior convictions secured, the task force could now connect timelines and reconstruct movement using modern mapping tools unavailable in 1981. By the time Brenda Gerow's remains were identified in 2015, the physical evidence from her case had been stored for over 3 decades, boxed, logged, and mostly untouched since the original investigation in 1981. What survived had done so thanks to a combination of standard evidence preservation and the diligence of a few unnamed evidence clerks who never purged the record. Among those items were a cigarette butt, a single silver earring, a bent bobby pin, a blue hair tie, soil samples, and degraded fragments of clothing fabric. All were initially logged, sealed, and archived by the Pima County Sheriff's Office. In 2025, forensic labs had tools investigators in 1981 could never have imagined. Modern reprocessing of cold case evidence became standard in Arizona following legislative funding for violent crimes units. Brenda's case was approved for full reanalysis using upgraded forensic workflows, including trace DNA extraction, lubricant compound mapping, and chemical compound matching. The cigarette butt was first. Recovered from the scene approximately 4 feet from Brenda's body, the butt had been labeled as a non-conclusive item in the original report due to lack of matches in fingerprint or DNA databases at the time. In 2025, technicians used enhanced low copy number (LCN) DNA testing, a method that allows for retrieval of minuscule traces of biological material. It produced a partial YSTR profile, male, non-excludable, with high probability but not a full match. The sample was degraded, likely due to exposure, but analysts were able to determine that the DNA came from a white male of Northern European ancestry. The profile was then uploaded to CODIS and familial search databases, but as of June 2025, no direct match had been returned. While not a smoking gun, it narrowed the pool. It also eliminated the possibility that the cigarette had come from Brenda herself. She didn't smoke Vantage brand, according to her family. That detail had been casually mentioned in her missing persons report, but now it took on forensic value. The second item reevaluated was the silver earring. Stored in a sealed polypropylene container, it retained trace lubricant residue identified as molybdenum disulfide, a compound commonly used in industrial roller door lubrication. In the 1990s, this chemical was not routinely tested in homicide work. Today, chemical spectrometry allows cross-referencing with known application areas. When compared with historical maintenance logs, it was found that the same lubricant type was used in local storage units within a 10-mile radius of the dump site during the early 1980s. The dump site was not random. It was likely near a location familiar to the killer. That finding aligned with Cal Hauser's rental record for a storage unit in the same sector during March 1981. The implication was clear. The body may have been kept in a storage environment before being moved. A secondary analysis focused on the bobby pin and hair tie. The bobby pin was oxidized, but mass spectrometry revealed microparticulates of talcum and cornstarch, a common compound in 1980s dry shampoo powders. That itself was not identifying, but matched with anecdotal statements from Brenda's friends, who had described her use of that product before traveling out of state. The most significant breakthrough, however, came from the soil samples collected beneath Brenda's back at the scene. In 2025, forensic geologists used X-ray fluorescence, XRF, to identify trace mineral differences in layered soil. Beneath the topsoil, they found a calcium carbonate layer not consistent with the surrounding area. That mineral signature matched substrate found under concrete pads, specifically in low-grade construction fill, suggesting her body had at some point lain on or under a man-made flooring material. This, combined with the lubricant trace and storage unit logs, strengthened the theory that Brenda had been stored, post-mortem, before being dumped in the desert. What these reanalyses proved was not just a clearer picture of what happened after Brenda died. They illustrated method. They provided behavioral consistency. This wasn't opportunistic violence. It involved delay, concealment, transfer, and chemical residue. It showed post-crime management, which is a hallmark of organized offender typologies. For law enforcement, it also meant they could now geomap the chain of movement. Brenda likely died elsewhere. Her body had been handled post-mortem, transported, and then placed deliberately. That required privacy, time, and geographic familiarity. The dump site was a final act, not the crime scene. In cases like this, evidence doesn't disappear. It just waits for science to catch up. By June 2025, a new case file was drafted under Brenda's name, updated with a full forensic appendix, relocation theory, chemical trace mappings, and post-mortem sequence reconstruction. The file was marked Open Homicide, Evidence Revalidated, POI Reclassified for Investigative Escalation. Her case was no longer cold in the forensic sense. What remained was for the data to point precisely at a single individual, backed by probability, not assumption. After confirming Brenda Gerow's identity in 2015 and re-evaluating all forensic evidence by 2025, investigators turned to a larger piece of the puzzle, the time in between. Brenda had vanished from New Hampshire in July 1980. Her body was found in Arizona in April 1981. That's 9 months of movement, opportunity, and silence. Filling that gap meant reconstructing a cross-state timeline. But this wasn't a straightforward job. There were no phone records, no credit card activity. Brenda hadn't been employed under her Social Security number after she left Nashua. She was off the grid. The only viable method was tracing known vehicle movement and documentable residencies of the person she left with. That man, now classified as a person of interest, had been in New Mexico and Arizona in the months following her disappearance. DMV records placed him in Albuquerque in August 1980, then Phoenix by late October, Tucson by March 1981, all under variations of his legal name, one of which matched his known alias used during a 1995 homicide case. There were vehicle titles transferred and a short-term rental agreement in Tucson signed in March. The rental address was later demolished, but archived property records confirmed he resided within 10 miles of the site where Brenda's body was found. What wasn't clear was where Brenda had been during this period. No neighbors recalled seeing her. No employers had her on file. The only indirect clue came from a former maintenance worker at a Tucson self-storage facility. In a 2025 re-interview, he remembered a quiet girl with dark hair who sometimes waited in a pickup truck outside one of the units, always with a man in his late 30s or 40s. He couldn't provide a date, but he estimated it was after the new year, which would place the sighting around early 1981. His statement wasn't enough for a formal identification, but it aligned with other verified data, especially the unit rental records and chemical traces found on Brenda's belongings. Taken together, it helped establish the likelihood that she remained under the suspect's control for an extended time leading up to her death. The final link in the timeline came from a single overlooked piece of paperwork, a service invoice for auto repair dated March 30th, 1981, listing the suspect's alias and a local Tucson address. The shop was located 3 miles from the desert clearing where the body was found 9 days later. Investigators believe the vehicle may have been used to transport Brenda's remains. That put the suspect in direct, traceable proximity to the dump site within 72 hours of her estimated time of death. It didn't prove he was the killer, but it confirmed he was logistically positioned to be. In homicide investigations, timeline isn't just about presence, it's about exclusion. If you can't place someone elsewhere when a body turns up and you can prove they had means, access, and motive, you're no longer asking if they were involved. You're asking how they explain their involvement. As of June 2025, law enforcement had mapped the following: Brenda's last known location, New Mexico, summer 1980. Suspects' recorded movements: Albuquerque, Phoenix, Tucson. Last verified sighting of victim, unconfirmed but consistent with January 1981. Body discovered April 8, 1981. There were no signs of Brenda being alive after she left Nashua. No calls, no sightings, no documents in her name. She existed only in proximity to one man. And when the evidence is that tight, investigators know the gap isn't empty. It's occupied by something someone didn't want found. The year 2015 was meant to be the turning point. A name had been restored to the woman once only known as Pima County Jane Doe, Brenda Gerow. It took 34 years, a forensic sketch, national DNA databases, and sheer persistence. Her image had been circulated widely, reconstructed digitally, and even featured in public exhibits. But nothing ever replaced the brutal fact. Someone had strangled Brenda to death in the Arizona desert and left her to decompose anonymously for decades. When her name finally surfaced, one question echoed louder than all. Who killed her? Investigators had their suspicions. They always did. The man at the center was Joseph Kalhauser, Brenda's boyfriend at the time she vanished from New Hampshire in 1980, the same man who would later be convicted in 2000 for murdering his wife, Diane Van Reeth, a man who had demonstrated an established pattern of control, violence, and manipulation, especially toward the women closest to him. The FBI and Pima County Sheriff's Department reopened the Gerow case with intensity, but years had passed and evidence had decayed, literally and legally. The autopsy had shown clear signs of strangulation, but there were no fingerprints, no DNA match from the scene, and no confession. The crime scene itself, an isolated desert stretch off Silver Bell Road, was compromised by time, erosion, and animal activity. The remains had been skeletal when discovered, and critical forensic leads that might have existed in 1981 were no longer recoverable. Investigators conducted multiple interviews, and Kalhauser was questioned again. He denied everything. He maintained that Brenda had simply walked away from their life together. No body, no crime, he had said for years. Now there was a body, but no new evidence to link him definitively. Legally, suspicion is not enough. The threshold for prosecution in a murder case, especially one this old, is beyond a reasonable doubt. In Brenda's case, they didn't reach that bar. Prosecutors considered filing charges. They reviewed everything: timelines, past abuse allegations, patterns in Kalhauser's behavior. They analyzed psychological profiles. They consulted forensic analysts. But without a living witness, physical evidence tying him to the scene, or a confession, the case stalled. In 2025, as of this writing, Brenda Gerow's murder remains officially unsolved, though Cal Hauser remains in prison for the murder of Diane Van Reeth. That's where the duality of justice becomes difficult to explain to the public. One man, two women, similar fates, but only one conviction. The reality is that the justice system is bound by evidence, not by intuition or emotional symmetry. It demands certainty, and when time erodes certainty, closure is delayed, sometimes indefinitely. Still, Brenda's name matters. For decades, she was reduced to a case number and a set of dental records. Her photograph sat in silence among missing persons archives, while her body lay buried under a generic headstone. That silence was broken when a sibling came forward with DNA, when her photo was matched, when she was returned, if not in body, then in name. Her family, upon hearing the truth, expressed sorrow but also relief. They had spent years wondering, fearing, imagining. Now they could grieve properly. They could place flowers on a grave that had a name. And in the world of cold cases, that is not a small thing. There is a larger truth here, one that should not be lost amid case files and courtroom gaps. Every unidentified body is a person. Every Jane Doe is someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's story. And every time one of those stories is uncovered, the balance of justice shifts, just slightly, toward accountability, even when the law cannot catch up. As of June 2025, no charges have been filed in Brenda Gerow's murder, but the case remains open, and if new evidence emerges, through DNA, through confession, through technology still developing, there's a chance her story will end, not just with a name, but with justice. Until then, her photograph stands not just as a record, but as a warning. Some crimes leave no fingerprints, only scars on the lives they disrupt. In the end, I've learned that truth doesn't always arrive with the sound of sirens or a slam of the gavel. Sometimes it comes quietly, through a name returned, a face remembered, and a family finally able to grieve. What happened to Brenda reminds us how fragile justice can be when time becomes the enemy. But it also proves that persistence, compassion, and science can reclaim dignity, even after decades of silence. Have you or someone you know ever waited years for answers? Do you believe every cold case deserves a second look? No matter how long it's been? If this story touched something in you, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. If you didn't enjoy it, I'd love to hear why. Let's talk. And if you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to subscribe. Your voice helps keep these stories alive.